And I want to start with the story Rachel was spent her hour with, and Rachel and I began discussing. Matt Miller, I'd like to begin with you on this. The idea that the Barr Justice Department is now officially launched a criminal investigation of the beginnings of the investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 election.
I think it's incredibly concerning, Lawrence. I think it's the most concerning development we've seen out of the Justice Department since Donald Trump became president. Look, if there was a crime committed, obviously it ought to be investigated. But we know more about the Russia probe and the origins of the Russia probe than probably any investigation in the Justice Department's history. Bob Mueller wrote a 450-page report that became public. The department released a FISA application from that investigation, something it's never before done in its history. There's been extensive reporting. And through all of that, we've never seen a single evidence of a crime, not even an allegation of a crime, something that would give a predicate to an investigation. And I think it's notable that in this story tonight, it doesn't say what the allegation of a crime is that the department is now investigating. If I know John Durham. I worked with him when Eric Holder appointed him to investigate alleged torture by officers at the CIA. And if I thought he were running this investigation alone, I would have some confidence in it. But I don't think that's what's happening. Bill Barr has been micromanaging this. He's been flying around the world to interrogate foreign officials about what happened. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the day after an ambassador goes up to the Hill and gives incredibly damning testimony about the president extorting a foreign government, that we see this leak from the Department of Justice. And I think it's incredibly concerning about the administration of justice and the rule of law in this country.
Joyce Vance, if Mr. Durham is an honorable, straight-shooting prosecutor, nothing for anyone to worry about.
Well, that's true, and it's not unheard of for prosecutors to use a grand jury investigation to close out allegations that aren't warranted. After all, if you want to leave folks with the conclusion that you left no stone unturned before you close an investigation without any indictments, this is a pretty good way to do it. And Durham has that sort of reputation. Nonetheless, as Matt says, this is deeply concerning. The Inspector General was already running an administrative investigation to see whether there had been any misconduct by anyone involved in the origins of the investigation. So it's always been troubling to have these parallel investigations, particularly one where the Attorney General of the United States, a person with a pretty full plate and a lot of work to do, seemed so involved that he was investing the time to fly all around the world. Always been very troubling.
Joyce, let me just get one more question on this before we turn to the story that maybe this story is intended to divert, which is, of course, the story of the investigation of the president. And that is, I spent an hour trying to figure out, okay, what crime can you possibly be investigating here? Because it is not easy for FBI agents to commit crimes in the course of their duties. It's not easy for prosecutors to do that. It's not easy for CIA officials to do that. There has to be some kind of crime. It seems the most likely thing would be something involving at least some kind of charge of perjury or a cousin of perjury somewhere in the law, some kind of false statement being made. But procedural irregularities are corrected by defendants that the investigators use procedural irregularities against. They're corrected by the appeals process and trials and all of that sort of thing. I can't figure out what they could possibly be seriously investigating as a crime here.
So what you're saying, I think, is extremely important. And that point is that if there are prosecutors or investigators who do things that are wrong in the course of an investigation, that comes to light during a prosecution, and defendants have the opportunity to move to dismiss the indictment, or judges exclude evidence, or in extreme cases, a conviction can be overturned. And so you're exactly right about that. Chuck Rosenberg and I had this conversation earlier tonight, and the cousin of perjury that we came up with was 18 U.S. Code 1001, making false statements to the government, or perhaps some sort of a leak involved with something to do with this investigation. It's very difficult to contemplate what the federal crime that investigators would be looking at so hard could possibly be.
Evelyn Farkas, I want to turn to what's going to happen next week. Tim Morrison testifying. You know Tim Morrison. What do you expect will happen in that testimony?
I think it will be different from Bill Taylor's testimony because Bill Taylor was a voluntary, super friendly witness. He was a guy who wanted to go and give the 9/11 report on everything he knew. You know, give the narrative, the full story, all the details. Tim is a different story. He's a political appointee. However, he's worked a long time on Congress, on the Hill, on the House Foreign Affairs Committee staff, and also in the Senate. He knows the Constitution. He will not, I do not believe that he will lie, but I don't believe that he will offer voluntary, fulsome information necessarily. So it remains to be seen. He may surprise us and be more forthcoming, but he may also just play it more safe as it relates to the president.
And Wendy Sherman, as the evidence closes in on the president, we are not hearing from any Republican in the House or the Senate a single comment on the evidence. You have Matt Gaetz leading this kind of congressional drunk driving rampage through the halls of the House to try to crash into the room. You have Lindsey Graham introducing a Senate resolution taking issue with how the House is doing business, which is the most meaningless document you could possibly raise. The idea of the House ever criticizing the Senate or the Senate ever criticizing the House is the most meaningless thing you can do. But no one is on the Republican side talking about the evidence.
I think we're seeing two things. One, because there is no substance they can attack. They are doing all process, and they're actually acting in pretty silly and ridiculous and absurd kinds of ways, as well as putting our national security at risk by bringing their cell phones into the SCIF, into the secure area in the House. That really is against the law, what they did, but also makes us vulnerable to Russian and Chinese hacking or getting into the phones and knowing what's going on there. They're going to have to clean out the SCIF all over again and reseal it. But we're also seeing the intimidation tactics that you were just discussing with Joyce and Matt, where you're really saying to witnesses who are going to come forward, be careful what you do, because we may come after you. And indeed, all of these people who are coming forward are patriots because they know they're going to get attacked. But they think that their commitment to the Constitution is so deep that they're going to do it. And I quite agree with Evelyn. I think we have to be very careful. I think Tim Morrison's going to be under tremendous pressure. Unless he gets his statement out quickly, he's going to be under tremendous pressure to be pretty nuanced in what he says.
And Evelyn, as Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez pointed out, some of the people who raided the room, Republicans, pretending that they were being locked out, were actually members of the committee and had reserved seats in the room that they could have been sitting in, which brings us to the fact that there's about 48 Republican members of the House who have the right to be in every one of these depositions, listening to every word. We don't know how many of them are exercising that right and how many of them are spending their time doing something else. But they are certainly in a position to reveal any evidence that they hear in that room that's helpful to Donald Trump, and we have silence from all 48 of them.
Right. I mean, look, I've actually been in that room. I actually testified. Part of the intimidation is not just being in the face of the witness, which was pretty much what they did to Laura Cooper, my successor once removed from the Defense Department, but it's also intimidating when you have to hire a private lawyer, right? It costs a lot of money when you're a government official. That's not in your household budget. So there are all levels of intimidation, and yes, they're not going to, if they had something they could reveal, you better believe they would have leaked it if it was helpful to them. But there's nothing. I mean, there's nothing exonerating Donald Trump thus far.
And Matt Miller, Ambassador Sondland, who one member of the committee told me the other night is in danger of perjury charges because William Taylor completely disagrees with Ambassador Sondland on key discussions that those two had. Ambassador Sondland is one of those rich guys who can afford the best criminal defense lawyers, and his very good criminal defense lawyers today came out with the he does not recall defense. They are attributing to their client that he does not recall the conversation in which William Taylor now is essentially saying Gordon Sondland lied under oath to Congress.
Yeah, he does have a very good criminal defense attorney, the same attorney that got Karl Rove out of being indicted when it appeared he had lied to the grand jury during the Bush administration. I think Gordon Sondland has a lot of problems. Look, he can't, if you just read his opening statement, even before Bill Taylor testified, he wanted you to believe that all the time that he was pushing for an investigation into Burisma and that he was talking to the president about this investigation, talking to others in the administration and outside, people like Rudy Giuliani, he had no idea that meant an investigation into Joe and Hunter Biden. He just thought it was a Ukrainian company apparently that had no connection to the president's political opponents. That was hard to believe on its face. If I were him, I would have been worried about going in and giving that kind of answer. If there's another witness that can come forward and say, well, Gordon Sondland said to me that this was all about Joe Biden. He knew everything that it was about. You then add on top of it the contradictions that appear between his testimony and Taylor's, and you have to look at which one of them would have a motive to lie. Bill Taylor has no reason to come up and lie to the committee. Gordon Sondland very much does, and I think I would be very concerned, if I were him at the end of this, that there's a referral to the Department of Justice. Not under this administration. Bill Barr's not going to do anything. But if there's a new government in a year and a half, there's a new administration, they might not take so kindly to members that go up and lie to Congress to protect the president of the United States.
Now, the president tried to hire Trey Gowdy as a possible impeachment defense lawyer. That didn't work out. Let's listen to Trey Gowdy defending exactly the way this investigation is being conducted behind closed doors. He actually offered this defense in 2015. Let's listen to this.
I can just tell you that of the 50 some odd interviews we have done thus far, the vast majority of them have been private, and you don't see the bickering among the members of Congress in private interviews. You don't see any of that. The private ones always produce better results.
Wendy Sherman, the Republicans seem to have no memory of their own conduct.
Indeed, not only during the Benghazi hearings, but during the Clinton impeachment hearings, much of it was done behind closed doors. These are House rules under which Adam Schiff and the rest of the House committees are operating. And as you pointed out at the beginning, 48 members, that includes Kevin McCarthy in his role as the minority leader, get to sit in those hearings, and there is equal time for questions, and they have been following that rule. So the Republicans get as much time as the Democrats to ask questions. Nothing has come out that doesn't corroborate what we heard, particularly from Bill Taylor.
And the Republican staff is filled in the chairs in the background of that room. There are so many Republican opportunities to reveal helpful information that comes out in those depositions to the president. They're not doing it. We have a right to believe that no helpful information is coming out there. We're going to have to break it here. Former Ambassador Wendy Sherman, Evelyn Farkas, Chase Vance, Matt Miller, thank you all for joining us in this important discussion. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.